So Ken Block, thank you very much for having us here at your place of business in Warwick, where you have 3 businesses here.
I do. I have my software business here. I have a traffic signal manufacturing business here, and I have the golf belt business, which we launched last year here as well.
So what's your what came first?
The software business. Yeah, that's how I'm trained. That's what my degree is in. I've been a software engineer, and I've been the owner of a software consulting and/or development business basically since 1987.
So, as a software engineer and developing systems and such, you seek out problems to provide solutions? Is that?
Well, we're hired by companies to build systems for them. We're hired by companies to troubleshoot existing problems that they have. And we're selling to state governments now our services to data mine for waste and fraud in programs like Medicaid, food stamps, that sort of thing. And we're flexing our muscles a little bit looking at voting data across the country.
Yes, indeed. And we'll get back to that in just a second. That's actually why we're here. But just out of curiosity, the Equifax crisis, would that be something? I'm not asking if you're working on that specifically.
No, so that's a problem ultimately for forensic security to get involved with, right? So experts in security would be diving in, understanding what weaknesses were there for Equifax and what happened. We are more on, so we'll look through millions or billions of records looking for fraud in a Medicaid program, for example, which is a little bit different than forensically determining who left the barn door open for a bunch of data, which is what you're talking about.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
As far as the election thing, that you've kind of resurfaced. You've been a candidate for governor 3 times?
Twice.
Twice.
Twice is plenty.
Twice is plenty.
Twice is a lot.
We'll move back to that as well. But of late, you have been kind of banging some pots and pans together, if you will, with regard to some irregularities in the voting process specific to the state of Rhode Island.
Yes, and also nationally.
So do tell.
Sure. And as we get into it, just as a quick lead-in, I have used the resources of my business to do data-driven analytics as it pertains to politics and government for quite a while. We looked at the cost of fire protection in Rhode Island, which was a big data project. I did a waste and fraud project for free for the state of Rhode Island in 2013, where we looked at the state's Medicaid and food stamp data. So what we're doing now in the voting information is, again, a public policy-driven big data project. And it started after the 2014 election, which I lost. And I had the state's voting data because as a candidate, you need that data to drive the business of running a campaign. And I decided to, since I had it, to look at it critically to determine if there was anything we could do with it from a waste and fraud perspective. And as we thought about it, we realized that there was actually a lot that we could do with it. And we began the process of, as an exercise for the people here, to, every once in a while I'll use some downtime to drive a project like this. And we decided to take a look at and build a system to data mine through voting data and to think about how we could take voting data from one state, marry it up to voting data from other states, and see what we could find when we apply fraud analytics to it. And that's what we did. And in 2015, using 2014 election data, we were able to identify people voting twice in 2 different states, specifically Rhode Island and Florida, Connecticut and Florida, Connecticut and Rhode Island, and we did small numbers because we didn't have a way to, using software, confirm the match. So we had to confirm the match through our own research, which was time consuming, right? But we, without a shadow of a doubt, we identified a few individuals who, through land records and other means of confirmation, we were able to find someone, let's say in Greenwich, Connecticut and Palm Beach, Florida, who property records show owns the property in both places, and they voted in both places.
So they actually voted.
These are all votes. It's not registered. Yeah, this is about everything we did involves a vote. So we took that. And we improved the software. We started to look for other things besides duplicate voting. And I decided, since I knew we now had a way to credibly find duplicate votes, that after the 2016 presidential election, that we would put this into play for as many states as we could get data from. And we ended up doing it for 21 states, which in and of itself was an interesting, well, it was an ordeal because some states won't provide the data no matter what. Other states will charge you an arm and a leg and then some for some of the data. So we ended up taking data from 21 states where the cost was somewhat reasonable. And they provided all the different pieces that we needed to do what we did. And as a result of all of that, we were able to find 8,500 people who cast votes in 2 different states for the 2016 general election.
8,500 out of how many voters altogether, approximately?
Well, there were 130 million votes, but now that's only with 21 states because the math involved is something called combinatorics. Every state that we add beyond the 21 begins to ramp up logarithmically because you're comparing the 22nd state to 21 other previous states. So we're on the very low end. So when you look at the number of combinations of states, we have 210 ways to combine the 21 states, but there's 1,200 ways to combine the 50 states. So we only have 20% of the combinations of states. So the numbers would end up about 45,000 if we had everybody.
But just using those 21 states, you've demonstrated that there is a defect in the process.
Very much so.
So,
in fact, the first time ever that voter fraud has been systematically looked for and proven and found.
And it's been proven, found, demonstrated with just the 21 out of the 50 or 51, however many you would call it. To what degree has your analysis given you any insight as to, there's been a lot of conversation since the last election over voter fraud and dead people voting and people voting twice, and lots of allegations with very, very little evidence to support it.
No meat on the bones.
Right, right. All apocryphal information. Where, so have your efforts kind of moved the ball forward as far as getting an actual handle on the...
Nationally, it's hard to know. The national conversation is fairly fraught.
With needless complexity.
Well, with complexity, with the topic of voter fraud tends to drive people crazy, insane, really. The Trump's attention to it has ignited passions even higher, right? So it's a very difficult conversation to engage in. It's hard to say what the impact is right now. I was invited to present to President Trump's Voting Integrity Commission, and I did that back in September. So there was a national focus on the findings that we had. As with most things that the Integrity Commission has dealt with, it comes with a big mix of positive and negative coverage to it.
Of course.
And the Integrity Commission, has had some of its own internal challenges as well. So
that's unfortunate.
So it's a little bit hard to get traction through that, but as a result of this focus on data and the national, and there's other things that we looked at. So besides the duplicate voting, we also took a look at, we had to digest and understand all the federal rules and regulations attached to voting, and there's a whole section of law where there's federal law that says you have to be a citizen, you have to register where your residence is. You're not allowed to register at a post office box, for example.
So 6 months in one day.
Well,
or
it's actually down.
Like that.
It's something like that. Exactly. So we decided to take a look at for the 80 million votes that we had from the 2016 election. We decided to look for things like who's registered to vote and cast a vote from a post office box or a UPS store, from a disallowed address of some sort, and tens of thousands of people did that. And those are not proper. In fact, those are violations of federal law. The way those votes are registered.
What is the penalty for? I think it was Ann Coulter apparently. No, she voted in 2 places in Florida. Sean Spicer was
Registered,
here
but not
in Rhode
voted.
Island.
So
but had he voted in
both
Rhode
places,
Island and Virginia?
That is a 5-year felony with a $10,000 potential fine attached to it.
And what is the level of enforcement of this particular law?
Non-existent, because nobody is doing the analytics like we've done to identify duplicate voters.
Huh. Interesting.
There's no federal or governmental agency at any level of government, local, state, or federal, that looks for duplicate votes between states.
When I was in college, every 10 years, with one exception over the last, I guess, maybe 40, I worked as a census worker, just during the every 10-year census. Over the past 20 or 30 years, there's been an ongoing conversation about sampling the data and applying that to the entire area instead of trying to ring every doorbell and get every individual household to respond specifically to the census process. With the 21 states that you have had to work with, from which you've been able to derive data, is that sufficient for you to expand the results of your analysis such that it would apply to the United States, to give you a general idea?
Well, yeah, so we can use the mathematical, we can extrapolate mathematically from the 21 states to all 50 states using combinatorics like I had suggested. But when you're talking about fraud, to extrapolate to fraud is not really ideal. You really want to have access to all the data. In fact, the fact that we could not get all of the data in and of itself exposes what I consider to be a tremendous problem with how our federal elections are conducted. The state of Massachusetts, for example, will, even though the state has a statewide database of voters who registered, as well as as well as the votes that they cast, which elections they voted in, they will not provide that data to anybody but the 2 political parties. And the 2 political parties are prevented by state law from sharing that with anybody. Now, what the state of Massachusetts will say, though, is they told me, well, you can't get our data, but you feel free to go to every single city and town in the state and get the data from that. There's 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts.
It's a virtual data dump.
It's more difficult to get the data from the state of Massachusetts than it is from the entire rest of the country combined. Okay. Now, what public purpose does Massachusetts' policy regarding their data serve? None.
Well, what public purpose, in terms of a positive public purpose,
correct,
I would agree, but this is the essence of the gerrymandering problem that has been extant for a good 10 years now. I just heard a very interesting conversation recently about how the first step is to get the voting information. Then you cross-reference that voting information with credit card information and whatever data is available to the public out there, and you can pretty much identify the likely inclination of these voters.
Oh, sure, no question.
And that's how the political parties, which seem to be the only ones who get access to the core data that you're required to do this whole thing, why isn't this, what's the word, public information? Why should you have to pay for it? And why should it be restricted only to the political parties, which are on their face? They have a special interest.
Let me break it down a little bit more for you. The data that Massachusetts makes almost impossible to get is data directly related to our federal election. What right do they have to prevent
That's my question.
Joe Citizen from being able to take that data and look at it, right? I mean, it's really, in my opinion, it's fairly corrupt.
With the perversion of states' rights.
So Maine will not provide the data except to the political parties. In New Hampshire, unless you're a registered political entity, you can't get it. Now, you can register fairly readily to become a political entity, but that it doesn't just feel wrong. I think it is wrong for a company like mine to register as a political entity in order to get the data from New Hampshire.
Or you have to solicit someone to
intercede on your behalf. Now, that's one way states make it hard. Another way is some states make the data largely unaffordable. Alabama and Arizona charge $30,000 each for their data. To frame that for you, Rhode Island charged $25. The state of California charged $30. The state of Florida charged $5. For the same exact data,
Right.
Arizona and Alabama want to charge $30,000. The state of Wisconsin wants to charge $12,500.
Is the data arranged, stored, formatted in the same way?
Every state does it differently. So it is a large technical challenge to take the data. And by the way, if we ever did engage to get the data from Massachusetts, it's very likely that most Massachusetts cities and towns store their data differently as well.
So, as an old boss of mine used to say all the time, you've presented me with a problem. What's the solution?
Well, the solution, ideally, would be federal legislation that standardizes and dictates the availability of data from the states. The states should not be able to charge obscene amounts of money for their data. They should make the data available at a reasonable cost. Now, reasonable cost should be close to free because it doesn't cost much to extract that data from a database and to present it in electronic format.
It's
just keystrokes.
You don't have to dig it out of the ground.
That's correct. They should also have rules about making it accessible to more than just political parties. Now, I understand the need and the desire to want to protect the identities of individual voters, but let's face it, the data in the voter registration record, namely your name, your address, your birth date, is known to the world already.
Right.
It is not private data. So for states to claim to want to protect the privacy of voters when that level, I mean, I could find your birth date like that on Google, just by Googling it. Or anybody. Your birth date is out there. Your name, address, and birth date is available to everybody. For states to claim they want to protect the privacy of individuals and use that as an excuse is extraordinarily disingenuous. So that's a basic thing, and you know, there's enough dysfunction nationally right now that I don't know that we're going to get that sort of attention to fix it, but that's where the fix has to come from.
But I would submit that we have the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations as kind of a laboratory.
And I've been using them heavily as a laboratory here. Yes.
And how's that going?
So I have had the good fortune, and I credit the Secretary of State's office and the Board of Elections here in Rhode Island with being fairly open and transparent with me over the course of this year, as I've spent hours talking to them, interviewing them about how they conduct their elections and asking and answering specific questions I had about different scenarios. I've got to believe some of their answers they're maybe wishing they hadn't given me over time. But in my interviews, I've discovered a number of problems, substantial, shocking problems with how Rhode Island conducts its elections. So as an example, one of the biggest ones, in an interview, it came out that it was possible to register to vote in Rhode Island without providing a driver's license and also not providing a Social Security number. To me, that was rather surprising because how do you conform to the federal law that says you have to be a citizen to vote if you're registering to vote and that information is not available? How does that work? So it's felt wrong to me, and at the time I didn't fully understand federal voting law, and I asked a basic question. I said, so if I wanted to register John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt to vote, a clearly made up fictitious person, and I made up a birth date, and I said that the address that John lived at was the address of my office here, a corporate office park, right? This is not a residence, and not in any way can it be construed as a residence. And I didn't supply a driver's license, and I didn't supply a Social Security number. Would the state of Rhode Island provide a voter registration for John? And the answer was yes, they would. And I went, wow, okay. So now John is registered to vote, but Rhode Island has a voter ID law. So how does John provide a driver's license or a Social Security number to vote? I said, so can John then walk into the Secretary of State's office?
Well, John doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist, but it's someone who says they're John.
Okay, I understand.
Walk in, and if they provided a laminated picture card that said that John was a member of Ken's Gym, which didn't exist, or if John was an employee of Ken's company, which doesn't exist, would you then provide a voter ID card so John can then vote? The answer was yes, we would. The state wouldn't verify that the gym existed, that John existed, that the address given was a residence instead of a business, right? None of those things would have happened. And John now, a completely fictitious individual, can vote at will. So, and that's in writing. I have that in writing from the Secretary of State's office. So then I asked the question, well, how many people in 2016 cast votes who did not have a driver's license and also didn't have a Social Security number in the voter registration database?
I would assume that's not knowable.
It is knowable because they have the voter registration database. So I asked the Secretary of State to tell me how many people who cast a ballot it did not have that data in their database. 464,000 people cast ballots in the 2016 presidential election in Rhode Island. 143,000 of those voters did not have Social Security numbers and also did not have driver's licenses in the voter registration database in that election. Nearly a third.
The requirement of providing your Social Security number and a driver's license or some other approved document, which that's a shell game in and of itself, depending on where you're talking about. There's some places where you're...
Well, it's actually a federal requirement. In 2002, the Congress passed the Help America Vote Act.
Yep.
And in the Help America Vote Act, it's very clearly laid out that a registering voter must supply a driver's license if one's been given to them. And if they don't have a driver's license, they must supply a Social Security number if one's been provided to them when they register to vote. It's mandatory to do.
But I've heard stories where they'll take your gun license, but they won't take your college ID card.
So those are alternative forms, and you only end up in those alternative forms if you haven't been supplied with the first two forms. That's the way federal law is written.
Right.
Now, turns out
that's a pretty broad loophole if you are inclined to game the system.
Well, if you're going to represent that you've never been issued a driver's license and you've never been issued a Social Security number, so therefore you're going to provide your hunting license instead, right? You're already on fairly shaky legal ground relative to what the federal law is. Now, the way states implement that federal law is interesting, and let me finish the story about the 1/3 of the voters who voted who are not identifiable by their data, right? The state has no idea who 1/3 of the people who cast ballots in 2016 are, because the state doesn't have their Social Security number, doesn't have their driver's license on file in the voter registration. What that means, practically speaking, is when one of those voters passes away, the state cannot remove them from the rolls because you need a Social Security number to confirm the passing.
We don't know you're dead.
We don't know you're dead. We don't know who you are. Now, the state told me right away, they said, well, you know, prior to the Help America Vote Act, it wasn't required for people to have that data in with their voter registration, although many did.
Sure, but it wasn't a requirement.
It was not. It was
facial recognition.
So then they said, you know, so that's kind of what it is, and we poked some more, and we found that 22,000 voters in Rhode Island in 2016 voted without the social and the driver's license who registered after 2003. After the federal requirement was in place for those individuals to have that data.
How are they able to register?
That's the question. So we identified that this happened, and then we pushed more, and we asked, how is it possible that this happened? And then it became an exercise of reading state law and federal law to understand how that happened. And it turns out that when Rhode Island passed the laws, rules, and regulations necessary to comply with the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002, the original rules and regulations that Rhode Island passed were directly in line with the federal requirements. And then in 2008, the Board of Elections changed those rules and regulations to no longer be in compliance with the Help America Vote Act. And what they did specifically was they said, you only have to supply your driver's license or Social Security number if you're registering to vote for the first time and you register to vote by mail or by third party. But if you register to vote in person, we don't require you to give us that information. That's the change.
What's the motivation behind that change?
Well, they made that change 2 months ahead of the 2008 general election. And as a result of that change, hundreds of individuals registered to vote without supplying driver's licenses or Social Security numbers, and then they voted in the 2008 general election. So I can't tell you for sure whether those people were eligible to vote or not, but it raises a serious question of why did the state of Rhode Island, in fact, how did the state of Rhode Island justify Where were the lawyers involved who should be part of all these rulemaking processes?
Sure.
By the way, and I've looked at the voter registration forms for all 50, well, for 44 of the 50 states.
Yep.
You can't actually look at the forms for 6 states. The only way you can get the forms in those states is to
live there.
get them in person from your board of canvassers or the other place.
Yep.
So, but in the 44 that I looked at, Rhode Island stands alone as saying right on the form, you only have to provide your driver's or your social if you're registering by mail or through a third party. It's right there. So no one else does that.
And so if you do it by mail, and you don't take a photograph of your driver's license, you just put your driver's license number down on the form, correct?
That's right. That's sufficient.
So you could, if it's 6 digits,
well,
you could just put a number down.
You could. The Help America Vote Act also requires states to verify the driver's license number with the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Okay, so that's the federal law. Now, tell me again, what's this? Because now I'm just wondering about the expense of this rigmarole is starting to sound expensive.
No, all the states already conform with it, and Rhode Island is already making sure that if a driver's license is submitted, they on federal law requires them to the electronic link is already there. Right, that work's been done, it's already there. And they also have to verify the last 4, if the Social Security number has been provided, they have to use their link to the Social Security Administration to confirm that data. But because of the way state law and regulations have been written, it looks like they're not even doing that verification if it's supplied if you register to vote in person, which a great many people do.
Right.
And the language also leaves out the people now registering to vote online. Right? It's silent about how that's to be treated. So there's a number of issues with state law. The bottom line is state law has left a wide gap open that a lot of people have registered now without providing the necessary information for us to know what it is. So now that leaves us with some very interesting analysis. Okay? Let's look at the 22,000 people who are now voting, who voted in 2016.
Yep.
Who legally were required to have a social or a driver's license in the system, who didn't. Let's break that down by town. Where do these people live? And does anything interesting pop out of that data?
Well, do these residences exist?
This is called comparative analytics.
Yeah.
And when we look at the 39 cities and towns and we look at the distribution of, what we did was we looked at the number of voters of those 22,000 who lived in each town relative to the total number of votes cast in each town.
Right.
And most cities and towns had between 3% and 7% of their vote in these 22,000. 3 communities are much higher than that. Gloucester,
right? Okay, that wouldn't.
Which is at 10%. So the average is about 6%.
Okay.
Gloucester is at 10%. Narragansett is at 12%, and Central Falls is at 22%.
I knew Central Falls was going to be in there.
22%. It's such an outlier.
Sure.
It's shocking.
Right.
Okay, and that I can't tell you what that is for sure. But that's something that needs to be looked at, because when you stand out that radically relative to everybody else, you have something that's worthwhile looking into.
Might Narragansett's it's 100% higher than the average.
It is.
Might that have something to do with the student population in that community?
That's a credible guess.
Okay.
It's a credible guess, right? I haven't looked at the data beyond that. I haven't looked at the addresses, and looked to see if they're concentrated.
Gloucester. And that just doesn't strike me as a hotbed of corruption.
It's an interesting issue, and it may be tied to the diligence of the local boards of canvassers in enforcing what the state regulations are, let alone what the federal regulations are. Right?
That's my next question. Having worked the polls in a few elections over the past few years, I have had colleagues for a day, where they know the people that are coming in. Yeah, you're good. Just sign here.
Yeah.
They're not checking any identification card or anything like that. It's like, I know you, and it certainly isn't countenanced by the town. They aren't told to do that, but you're dealing with people.
Yeah.
So
I mean, so that's there's all and so now that's adherence to Rhode Island law, right? Whether individual actors at the board with the board of canvassers or poll workers are acting in the way as required under state law, federal law, state regulations, federal regulations, right? I mean, so there's a big mix. We then looked at legislative districts. And you see the same thing. So Central Falls legislators have gigantic outlier status relative to all the other legislative districts in terms of these the percentage of these 22,000 voters who are voting without required identification. When we turned it around and we looked at all 143,000 voters, right? So that this includes the 22,000 who by law should have had it after 2003, plus the 120 whatever thousand who don't have it as a result of maybe being grandfathered from before, or sloppiness or whatever.
Sure.
Gloucester is at the top of the heap. And 45% of the votes in Gloucester were cast in 2016 by voters who did not have the ID required now by law.
Half.
And the lowest, shockingly, was Providence at 20%.
To what do you attribute this?
I suspect Providence was more diligent at requiring this data over time, and that Gloucester wasn't. That's my guess. Right? I can only conjecture about these things. So that's one substantial finding, and Rhode Island is absolutely violating federal election law by the way we're running our voter registration right now. We are in stark violation.
What is the enforcement apparatus at the federal
level? The Department
level?
of Justice. We've sent a referral to the Department of Justice on this issue.
Have they even responded?
They've confirmed they have it.
Right.
This is only about 3 weeks now that it's been out there. It's recent.
Okay.
And and we've asked them to intervene and enforce the law. It turns out in 2006, the Department of Justice intervened in New Jersey with extremely similar situation. And New Jersey was compelled to sign a consent decree that they're going to clean things up, they're going to backfill the missing data, and that was all done in 2006.
Is that the objective in your mind for Rhode Island?
Absolutely. We should not be conducting our elections in violation of federal election law.
So what is the process by which you remedy this situation?
Well, hopefully I've taken it, which is sending the referral to the Department of Justice.
And they come in and just take over the operation?
They're gonna review it all. Well, they're gonna probably, hopefully, if they engage, require a consent decree from Rhode Island that we are going to clean this up. Here's how we're going to do it, and Rhode Island will consent to backfilling the missing data.
Right.
I will tell you that since that complaint was filed with the Department of Justice, the Secretary of State's office has now changed how the online voter registration works, and you are notified when you go online to modify your voter registration. If you had that data missing, they ask you to fill that data in.
What's the nature of your relationship with the Secretary of State's office now as opposed to, say, a year ago?
Well, a full year ago, it was cordial. We ignored each other. I will tell you that in the first 4 months of the year or so, they were very open and fairly transparent with me in exchanges of information. As soon as we started coming out with findings, the Secretary of State was attacking my professionalism, she was attacking my credibility, she was attacking the methodology that we applied to the looking for duplicate votes, that sort of thing.
So is this motivated by embarrassment or hostility?
I don't know, but it was a fairly shocking display. And it all stopped when we filed the Department of Justice complaint.
Well, because there's no point. The exercise is moot.
Well, it is moot. Not only is it moot, it's stark. What they're doing is federally prohibited, right? They're violating federal law and how they run our elections, and there's no excuse for it. So I'm happy that the state is beginning to react in a positive, productive way to some of the findings that are there. It's shocking and wrong that they were attacking the messenger as opposed to dealing with the problems before things went.
That's become the custom in the political culture in this country.
I guess so. And the Secretary of State's office is not the only actor in this. It's also the Board of Elections, which is a totally different governmental body. And they don't operate. They operate as peers. There's not a boss. They're peers to each other. As they're running elections. In fact, the Secretary of State's office has very little to do with the operation of elections. Right. It's mostly in the Board of Elections itself.
Where's the Attorney General?
Where is the Attorney General? Last I heard, he was in Florida.
But wouldn't this be something just as a natural matter of course that the Attorney General's office would be involved in what you're describing as a criminal activity.
Well, so it turns out through a lot of case law, including a U.S. Supreme Court case, that the only entity of any kind who has any standing to force states to adhere to the Help America Vote Act is the Department of Justice. Nobody else has any ability to do it. No individual has standing to bring a complaint.
What would you surmise? I wouldn't expect you to know the answer to this, but if you had to guess, Rhode Island has this problem that you've just described. How do you think the state of play is in the other 49 states?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a complex question. In a brief look at voter registration forms, nobody stuck out with duplicating the problem that's here in Rhode Island.
Really?
Okay? But this is a very specific problem. Rhode Island's saying we're only going to collect this information if you register by mail or through a third party, with the implication meaning if you register to vote in person, we don't collect this data.
And what do you suppose the motivation was for that? It doesn't sound like chicanery, because I don't...
Well, the timing of it is extremely suspect. This change was made 2 months before the 2008 general election.
Mm-hmm. At the behest of?
It's unclear.
Yeah,
at who.
It's hard to imagine.
But so the state was in line and complying with the federal rules and regulations until 2 months before the 2008 election, when they changed it to no longer be in conformance, then effectively left the barn door open for a lot of people to register to vote without supplying the required information.
So to remedy this would entail an intervention by the Department of Justice.
I've asked the Department of Justice. The Secretary of State has already taken some action to backfill some missing data.
Yeah.
And the Board of Elections held what for me was a contentious meeting 2 weeks ago.
There are people that are comfortable with the status quo, where everything's out of whack.
So, one of the commissioners on the Board of Elections has taken to attacking me in social media, and also from his seat as a commissioner of the Board of Elections. That's what was uncomfortable about it. But the reason for the meeting, one of the agenda items was to discuss my findings and my complaint to the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
And the board is in the beginning stages of taking their procedurally required actions to get ready to change some of their rules and regulations. So that's a multi-meeting process that they've begun. Let's see if they actually tackle the problem that I identified, or if they tackle some other problem instead. I have some reason to believe they may not tackle the specific problem.
What level of dispatch they might apply to this endeavor?
You know, but I mean, I've talked to, in 2002, the state of Rhode Island convened a commission of lawyers and other elections experts to craft our rules and regulations to adhere to the Help America Vote Act. And I've heard from 2 of the people on that commission and they told me, yeah, you're right. We were in line when we put all those rules in place, and what they did in 2008 is clearly in violation. So it's there. I think the Secretary of State has stopped her attacks on me, coincident with the complaint to the Department of Justice.
Right.
So I'm pretty sure, I'm very comfortable that we've identified it correctly. It's a serious problem, and hopefully one that they'll address.
Okay, so 2018 is coming up right around the bend.
Yeah.
Got any plans for next year?
I'm looking at the playing field right now. The Republican primary is going to have 4 individuals at least running in it, competing for 25,000 votes.
Yeah.
That's insanity. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. I have one election left to credibly run. Is it this one? I'm not sure.
That? You have one left.
I've run twice. So, you don't want to be the perennial candidate.
Right.
I have a ton of additional stuff on my resume from the last time that I ran. I'm a serious issue-driven candidate.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that this race has any chance of being an issue-driven race.
Not even with this issue.
I'll tell you what, if these issues are not fixed, I would never run. Because I believe that there's serious enough problems here that I believe it could definitely impact the results of races. And I won't participate in something that I consider to be potentially corrupt.
What do you think? What is your impression of the state of play with regard to partisan politics in Rhode Island? And the context of my question is, in communities and throughout the state, it is increasingly difficult to distinguish the Republicans from the Democrats. And combined, those two partisan designations, more often than not, don't seem to measure up to the independent vote.
I think we have a political problem in Rhode Island. I think that a lot of people engage in politics who really don't know how to fix a whole lot of what's broken. I think it's a bipartisan problem. Engaging in politics is difficult. It's abusive, right? It is not for the faint of heart. In Rhode Island, I think that your average person has every reason to never consider running for any office. I just think that that's sort of where we've gotten right now. That's not healthy for our democracy.
It's so true, though.
We have some serious problems here that require serious solutions, and all too often, I don't think we end up electing people with the right set of leadership skills, the right set of knowledge, foundational knowledge, or frankly, the ability to have the right network of people come in to provide the solutions that are necessary. I think that's a bipartisan problem as well. And so how do you, our elections have become popularity contests to a large extent.
Of course.
And that's not a great metric on which to decide, picking your leaders who are theoretically going to be doing the right thing for the population.
But would you construe this as a partisan problem, or is it an environmental problem, if you will, where, I've said for years, you've got to be out of your mind to run for president. Now you've got to be out of your mind to run for school board. I mean, it really is so injurious.
It's toxic and it's fraud. They're all fraud. There's no question. Look, I see a lot of quality people at the local level, doing, operating on what they believe is for the right thing. I mean, I've watched people that I have a lot of respect for fight for and win local seats, and then deal, with the issue and try to deal with things on the up and up. When you get into the General Assembly, I really have disgust for our General Assembly across the board, for the simple reason that on the House side of things, you have 75 individuals who run for and won their seats in the General Assembly. One of their very first actions that they take as members of the General Assembly is to cede almost all of their individual authority to the Speaker.
Yes.
It's one of the first considered actions that they take. And they do so out of fear, because if I don't, then if I take a principled stand and say no, I'm going to be punished. I won't be able to do anything, right? Or whatever it's going to be. But we have a corrupt General Assembly for the simple reason that all of the power of the House is embodied in the Speaker, and it happens on the very first day of the session when they vote on the rules that hand him all that power. It's utterly wrong, and it's corrupt. And what you're seeing are 75 individuals saying, I give up, right? Here you go, so I can get my 2 or 3 breadcrumbs.
And what's the ratio of Republicans to Democrats within those 75 individuals, approximately?
It's 85, 88% Democrat. But even within, that's not I mean, we've seen plenty of evidence that the Democrats are not a solid party. That there's some pretty massive schisms within it. It doesn't matter. I mean, Republicans don't vote against the rules, right? They all almost every time unanimously say, "Here's all my power. I'm giving it to you," and then then everybody gripes and moans about the fact that they can't get anything done. The rules of operation are a travesty. They need to be changed. And I know there are individuals up there that I've spoken to, smart people on both sides of the ideological divide, who would love nothing more than to get in there and change those rules.
But the people in charge, the Speaker, and I don't mean to attack him personally, but the person occupying that position, the rules are there to cater to his whims from what you just described.
And he or she the person in that position will ruthlessly make anyone pay who is going to attack those
It's not
rules.
reasonable to expect otherwise.
That's right. So what's required is, there needs to be a revolution inside the General Assembly where everybody decides that they're going to risk the wrath of the Speaker's office to fundamentally change the rules of the game so that things can get done outside of the graces of the Speaker.